Hello again, it's Mozart Monday time already, and this week I'm going to be answering some viewers' questions. Thank you very much to those who sent them in. The first one this week comes from Jill, and I'll read you what she's written. Something that has always puzzled me is the wow factor of the first two notes of Mozart's 29th Symphony, ever since I first heard it 50 years ago. There's nothing unusual about the octave interval between them. Perhaps it's the combination of notes played by the strings, or maybe it's just the peculiar way my brain works. Well, I don't think your brain's peculiar because my brain works in the same way. I've always found this an extremely tender and quite moving and surprising opening to a symphony. And I've often thought about why. We have to think about why so that when we rehearse it, we get it right. Let me just play what those first two notes are that Jill's referring to. There we are, a very simple octave. But in context, there's something very beautiful. And let's just listen to a performance of that now so we can hear what we're talking about. So, why does that falling octave have such a sort of emotional impact? In a way, the octave itself does have that effect. It's like standing in an elevator that suddenly moves and your stomach drops a little bit. And I've been looking around for other examples of this falling octave. This is the beginning of Mozart's D minor string quartet, another rare piece of minor key Mozart, and again a very tender octave drop at the opening. In fact, the octave drop doesn't always have that effect. In this very symphony, the 29th Symphony, the fourth and final movement begins with an octave drop. Here it's very vigorous and quite different. There's your octave drop, the two A's. Let's just listen to that in context. Why does that have such a different emotional impact to the falling octave at the beginning of the first movement? Well, I think obviously the answer must lie in what's going on underneath, in the harmonies and in the accompaniment. Now, I've been playing around with a little app on my iPad and I've recorded the accompaniment without the first violins. So obviously the cellos and the violas are an octave too high, but just listen to the accompaniment on its own and let's see what it's doing. The two most interesting and unusual features of this are first the very slow moving nature of this accompaniment. The lower three string parts all move slowly in minutes, which is slightly surprising at the beginning of what's basically a fast and lively movement. And the second feature here is the harmony. Now he could have harmonised this very, very simply, some simple tonic and dominant chords, but what he provides is much, much richer. You may have noticed this lovely chromatic scale coming up in the violas and the cellos. As I say, it provides a much richer and much more gorgeous accompaniment, which again is a surprise so early in this movement. Now, I've actually reimagined what this accompaniment might have been. It's something that's still Mozartian, but it's a little bit livelier, a little bit boppier. And let's see what it would sound like, first of all, without the melodic line on top. When we put the tune back over the top of it, some of the tenderness does remain because the octave fall is still there and the harmonies are the same. I haven't changed those. But the sort of boppier accompaniment really does change the character of the music. And let's just hear roughly how it would sound like. So there's my answer. The real magic here isn't necessarily in the melody, it's in what happens underneath, in the wonderful rich harmonies and this surprising, gorgeous, slow-moving string line that fits underneath that falling octave melody. Our second question today comes from Matthias, and by a strange coincidence it's also about Mozart's 29th Symphony. I'll read you his question. My question concerns appoggiaturas, which is a subject you have already touched on. It's true, I talked about that in relation to the first movement of Mozart's 40th Symphony. I'm wondering about a violin passage in the first movement of Mozart's Symphony No. 29 in A major, starting at bar 41. In some recordings, the notes of the appoggiaturas are played separately. In others, the first note is sort of slurred into the second. The result sounds dramatically different. I would really like to know your thoughts on appoggiaturas in Mozart's music, and whether he or his father left precise instructions on how to interpret them. Well, before I talk about that, let's just hear the passage in question. So, in answer to the question, did Mozart or his father leave instructions on how to play ornaments? The answer is yes. Leopold Mozart, the father of Mozart, wrote a book called A Treatise on the Fundamentals of Violin Playing, and in chapters 9, 10 and 11 he deals with ornaments. And his contemporary C.P.E. Bach wrote a book, The True Art of Playing Keyboard Instruments, and both of these were fundamental texts at the time for performers and composers to refer to, which gave instructions on how to play ornaments. I'll just give a little bit of terminology here. An ornament is any kind of embellishment that goes to decorate the notes that are written on the page. Now, originally, these would have been improvised by performers, but gradually composers started to notate their own ornaments. And when a performer saw an ornament written on the page, they knew that that had already been thought of and not to add their own embellishments on top of that. A grace note is what we call an ornament that comes before the written note. And there are two types of these grace notes. It's usually a single note. The most common is the appoggiatura, which is what's in this question. And that's a note usually of the same value as the note that's written, and it kind of leans on that note and then resolves onto the note in question. There's a shorter version of this, which comes before the note, before the beat, and is kind of crushed and is an appoggiatura. And I'll just play you the two versions of that. If here's our note, an appoggiatura will go, and an appoggiatura will go. So hopefully those are quite clear. Now the problem we have is that until the 18th century, composers used the same notation for both. And I'll just show you what that would look like. They also used the same note length, irrelevant of how long they wanted these appoggiaturas to last. So if you look at figure 1 here, there's our appoggiatura before notes of varying lengths, but they're all this little quaver. Now during the 18th century, they started to get a bit more precise, and they started to use different lengths of appoggiatura. And so we started to get a better idea. But in the time of Mozart, they would all look like this. And that's one reason why Leopold Mozart felt compelled to write a book explaining how we approach this problem. The appoggiatura, the notation for that didn't come in until the 18th century as well. Here it is here, with a little line through it. If you see this little line through a note, you know that it must come before the beat and crushed. But again, Mozart and Haydn didn't really use this little slash. And so it's up to us to work out where it's an appoggiatura, something that comes before the beat and is crushed, and where it comes on the beat. Now, books have been written, many books, many contradictory books have been written about how we play grace notes. It's something we all had to study at university, and you can have a roughly sort of calibrated set of rules, but there are so many exceptions and so many arguments about whether it should be this or whether it should be that, that I have to be really honest. In the end, I just tend to go with what sounds best. The basic rule is that if you see an appoggiatura, it should take half the value of the note that's coming up. So if you see what we have actually in this example, which I've written out here in example 3, it's always before a crotchet. Even though he's written them as a semiquaver, it's always for a crotchet. Now, what he's actually written sounds like this. A little short semiquaver. If we apply Leopold's Mozart rule, it should sound like this. So a slightly more singing version. And this is what Matthias is referring to. I think in some recordings, they play them evenly like this. Whereas actually, as he very rightly points out, on our Mozart player's recording of this, we play them short. And it does bug the question why. It's a fair enough question. Why did we do that? Now, my own answer is that I felt that the character of the music at this particular moment was best served by a shorter note. And I confess I didn't go back and look at Leopold Mozart and work out what we maybe should have done according to his rules. But it's really important, I think, that these rules were there to help us play, to help us understand, and to help us come up with a convincing performance. And I think so many centuries have passed now. And I think it is up to us as performers to come up with a version that we feel is most convincing for the music. And I think the fact that there's variety in this is great. It's much more enriching to have different interpretations and different performances. And we, if you like, can choose the one we prefer. Now, funnily enough, later in this movement, just a few lines further down, there's another line of appoggiaturas, or are they acciaccuturas? I'll just show you here what Mozart wrote. There they are, these little semiquaver grace notes next to a minute. Okay, so according to the Leopold Mozart instructions, this should take half the note value of the note value it's attached to. So they should sound like this. Now I have to say, I've never heard them played like that in this symphony. They're always played short, sometimes before the beat and sometimes on the beat. In our performance, we play them on the beat and short. And funnily enough, in the performance that Matthias referred me to earlier, they play them crushed before the beat. I bring this up in a way just to exemplify that even if you apply the rules earlier, almost immediately they then not apply the rules later. And I think it just goes to show that the whole thing is an incredible can of worms, a rather entertaining can of worms, and one that people have made livelihoods out of and written books on. But these are just a couple of little examples to show that in the end, I think we have to choose what we feel most convinced by and what we feel serves the music best. So I'll leave you with another little bit of Mozart 29. I have to say that we don't have time to deal with all the questions this week, so if your question hasn't been answered, I do apologise, but I'm hoping to come back to this possibly in a few weeks' time and look at some more of your questions. This is my last Mozart Monday for a little while. I'm handing over the baton next week to Michael Collins, and I hope you enjoy his presentation. I'm sure it'll be absolutely wonderful. So it's been real joy for me to be doing these for the last 4 weeks. Thank you very much for listening. Stay well, stay safe, and keep enjoying your Mozart. Bye-bye.